Okay. Okay. Like you said, my name's Deb Twigg, and basically, how many of you remember your 4th grade field trip? Taking you back, aren't I? Well, I remember mine because it was to Spanish Hill. And Spanish Hill is a glacial moraine, a little hilltop, right there in the middle of town. And I remember running to the top and being all winded, playing on this very flat top. It was very quiet up there. It was 230 feet straight up. And then we just all went off and ran and played. And there was this one kid, I always like to point this out, there's a young kid that was in our class. We used to all pick on. We were horrible kids. His name was Duncan Northrup. And Duncan, if I could ever find him, oh, how many apologies I owe that kid. That day, he went off underneath a tree and played by himself. We all went out, ran, played, did everything. Teacher calls us back by the end of this, and there he is with his arm around Duncan. And Duncan had a big old, fully grooved axe in his hand he had found underneath that tree that day. And that gives me chills, because that was Duncan's day, you know? That was Duncan's day, you know? And I'll never forget that field trip. That was just an amazing part of my childhood. I now run a museum. I now do all of this stuff. And we do the 4th grade field trips for the area. And it's just so exciting to give back with all of that I've experienced in my life. Really forgot about Spanish Hill for a long time. Bought a house below it back in the 90s. And my computer just happened to be looking out the window. So I'm typing along, internet's brand new, you know, you're out there, you're researching. And I'm looking out at the hill all the time. Big turkey vultures, always, you know, flying around the hill. And one day, for whatever reason, I come across this thing that says Carantouan. And it has to do with Spanish Hill. And I'm like, wait a minute, I've grown up here my whole life. I've never heard this word before. In fact, I thought it was Carantouan or something, you know, because you just read it and you're just like, I don't know what it's called. Well, come to find out, that changed my life that day. I basically ended up calling up the president of the Carantouan Greenway. I found the name out there on the web. So I call up Marty Borco, happened to be the state legislator too. Called him up and I said, Marty, can you tell me about Carantouan and Spanish Hill? He's like, oh, no way. If you ever do figure it out, let me know. There's so much controversy about that. We're out. We just use the name. I thought, isn't that weird? So then, I call up the local museum down in Athens, and I say, can you tell me about Carantouan and Spanish Hill? And they said, it's not Carantouan, and there's no giant skeletons. Click. And I'm like, well, now I'm really going to look into this. This sounds like fun. So before it was over, I went out, I did a whole radius around the area, got every report, every book, every lecture, everything over the last couple hundred, well, 150 years of people talking about Spanish Hill. Read it all. And then I'm really excited because living there all my life, I still didn't know the story that I had just found out. And I was so excited. And I went out and I got a projector and a laptop and I said, you know what, I'm going out there, I'm going on the road. I'm going to tell everybody about this story. I love it. I'm going to do it for free. I just want people to know about this story. And it wasn't until I got on the Pennsylvania archaeologist list one day and typed in, hey, I got to tell you all about it. And oh, brutal beating that I took. And it was, how ignorant can you be? Haven't you read Barry Kent's book on Susquehanna's Indians? And yada, yada, yada. So I go and I get his book. Because I figured, well, it must be I am ignorant. So I go and I get his book. And on page 301, he starts in about Spanish Hill. And what he says is, nothing's there. That it's all myth and legend. That Moorhead was there in 1916, never found a thing. And he names some other people along the way. And in fact, he names one of the co-founders of our museum, Ellsworth Cowles, and says that he is the one that started the whole myth in the first place. Unfortunately for him, though, I read all of those reports that he was referring to, and I knew exactly where he was wrong. And so it only made me go back and say what I had to say. So I actually wrote a paper, 49 pages, just hitting everything that Barry Kent had to say and showing where he screwed up, on and on and on. I was published in 2005 in the Pennsylvania Archaeologist about Spanish Hill and it being the place, most probably, of Carantouan. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on where this is all coming from. Okay? So this past year was the 400th anniversary of this story, Carantouan. This is my book, and actually this gives you all that background information. I'm going to give one to Dave, so anybody that wants to take a look at it, they can. This was when I was published. And this, actually, 2005 was a great year because that's also when I got together with two other gentlemen that are now 91 today that actually had big parts of the whole story of Spanish Hill. Spanish Hill is what brought us all together to make SRAC. 2005 is when we co-founded and incorporated and created that. And I don't think Barry Kent probably liked that a little bit, but that was the editor that put that in there. So, so I'm trying to now just build a picture for you, okay? 1615. I mean, can you picture what this place looked like in 1615, or even what that time period looked like? So, 1607 is the Jamestown story. That's how far back we're going, okay? 1615 is this story. It's not until 5 years later that the Pilgrims are going to land at Plymouth Rock. So that's how far back in history we're going. Okay? And it all starts with this guy right here, Samuel Champlain. And he wrote, like annually, he wrote a whole book on his explorations here in North America. Okay? So, out of the pages that we're going to look for, this is where it begins. Because he's the one that told the story. This is a map that he included. And if you look, you see this little dotted line? See it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That is Carantouan. And that is what I believe is Spanish Hill. So, this is where we're going to begin. I'm going to read right out of his book, okay? It says, in 1615, Samuel Champlain started the story. On the 7th of August, he says, they received intelligence that a certain nation of their allies, this is the Hurons that he was with, and he says, dwelling 3 good days' journey beyond the Entohanarons, which are the neuters, on which the Iroquois also make war, desired to assist them in the expedition with 500 good men. This is a very important text, just a little bit that he's saying, but he's saying a lot. He's basically saying, whoever these people are that are going to help the Hurons in this battle, have enough people to give up 500 warriors to walk away from defending their own area and go to battle for these very dear friends of theirs that live 3 days away, probably 300 and some miles away, right? I think that says a lot. He also goes on to say these people down there captured the year before, 3 Dutchmen. And he says that, nevertheless, they did not fail to send them back without harm. He goes on to say, this nation is very warlike. They have only 3 villages. And in the midst of more than 20 others on which they are constantly making war. And he goes on to say that they almost wipe out one for another to go to the top and almost get wiped out. It's just this constant battle going on in the area. And if you look at his map, he's got different groups all over the place, different villages. That's it. We don't hear anything more about Carantouan until 8 years later. What he did was he got a hold of the 16-year-old Etienne Brulé, Stephen Brulé. Have any of you ever heard of him before? Probably not. He's 16-year-old, and he sent him down to Carantouan to get those 500 warriors, okay? And it's not until 8 years later that he runs back into this guy. And he says, now there was with this man, Etienne Brulé, one of our interpreters, who had been living with them for the last 8 years as well to pass the time and to see the country and to learn the language and mode of life. He is the one with whom I had dispatched with orders to go to the direction of Carantouan in order to bring with him 500 warriors they had promised to send to assist us in the war in which we are engaged against their enemies, a reference to which I made in my previous book. I called this man and asked him, hey, why had you not brought the assistance of the 500 men? And what was the cause for the delay? And why he had not rendered me a report? Thereupon he gave me an account of the matter. He proceeded to say that after taking leave of me to go on his journey, he sent out with those 12 savages whom I had given him for the purpose of showing him the way and serve as an escort. They were successful in reaching Carantouan, but not without exposing themselves to risk. Brulé and his savage companions encountered some hostile savages. How many savages can you say in one sentence? Yeah. Who were worsted by our savages, 4 of the enemy being killed on the spot and 2 taken prisoner, whom Brulé and his companions took to Carantouan by the inhabitants, in which place they received with great affection and cordial welcome, a good cheer, with dances and banquets with which they were accustomed to entertain and honor the strangers. Some days were spent in this friendly reception, and after Brulé had told them the mission and explained to them the occasion of his journey, the savages of the place assembled to counsel and to deliberate and resolve in regard of sending those 500 warriors. He says, when the council was ended and it was decided to send the men, orders were given to collect those warriors. Prepare them, arm them, so as to go and join us where we were encamped before the fort of the enemies. This was only 3 short days from Carantouan. So he had to go another great distance with these 500 warriors. And he says, the place was fortified, had high, strong palisades, well bound and joined together, the quarters being constructed in a similar fashion. And we now know that that was actually against the Onondaga up near Cayuga Lake. And you see that whole collection thing. So basically, his dotted line stops here. He meets here with the leaders, right? And then they make a decision. And then what they do is they go out to the villages, collect the 500 warriors. That takes quite a bit of time to get all of that together, right? He said that if they delayed any longer, they would not find us here. And in fact, they did not succeed in arriving until 2 days after we left. So, in the end, Champlain actually gets shot in the leg and actually gets carried back on the back of one of the warriors back to where they were going. they weren't going to Carantouan. And so when Brulé got up there, and he's like, oh boy, he turned around and he went back with the people of Carantouan. And there he stayed for several years. And that's what he says right there. He goes on to talk about his travels, and he says while awaiting an escort back to where Champlain was, he explored the country, visiting other tribes and territories, and then making a tour along the river that goes in the direction of Florida, where many powerful and warlike nations are carrying on wars against each other. You know anything about the Susquehannocks? They basically wiped out everybody along the Susquehanna all the way down. The climate there is very temperate, and there are great numbers of animals in abundance of game. He continued the course along the river as far as the sea. Big tip right there. And among the other things he observed was the winter was very temperate, and when it snowed, it didn't stick on the ground for very long. So he went all the way down. So that's the story. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start showing you some of the pieces that really puts it all together. Okay, because right now we just heard a story that could be anywhere, right? And that was Barry Kent's story. How can you nail it down to this place? Let me show you how we do that. So he says, first, they told us that the preceding year, while making war, they captured 3 Dutchmen who were assisted by their enemies. Actually, we know the story on the other end, the Dutch. So they brought these 3 kidnapped people back to the Dutch, and this guy right here, Cornelius Henderson, anybody ever heard of the Henderson Map? Well, he actually makes a map of where these 3 Dutchmen were. This is the Henderson Map. This is the Carantouan Map. You can say, yeah, I'm not so sure yet, right? This is the later Henderson Map. And I gotta move this over just a little bit, because this is the most important part. See, it says the Susquehanna. See that? This is where he says they were captured. And you see what that is right there? What would these lines be on a map? Lines of latitude. And what is that? Well, it's number 42. And guess what? Spanish Hill is located right there. This is what it looks like. Oh, that's what it looked like in the 80s. See, there's the Chemung. The Susquehanna comes along this side. And that's a couple miles out. This right here, the Chemung, actually meets with the Susquehanna, just like that prior map. You see? Susquehanna, and see how it breaks off? That little... This right here, we call Tioga Point. It's in Athens. It's 3 miles south of Spanish Hill. This is what I drive by every day when I go to work. I'm up on the other mountain next to it. That's what it looks like today. I took that just a couple months ago. See that flat top? This one kind of lends to the idea too. If I go back, you see that clearing up there is that silent clearing that I was talking about that we got up to and were playing on that day. You see? And the steep sides that go up to. This hill was almost all taken for highway fill. And if it wasn't for Ellsworth Cowles and those guys, it would be gone today. Because it's really just gravel and all that type of stuff. It's just glacial. dropping. We'll go in and talk about it a little bit later, but I want you to look at this clearing, because that clearing is very important. It's totally flat, and at one time, and I'll show you the maps in a little bit, this was reported to have a wall, an earthen wall, all the way around 10 acres at the top with an interior ditch. And that, I love that flat little crown it gives. So it is a glacial moraine. You know, basically, what's in it stayed. Didn't get washed away or eroded, or it could have been a kettle. Not a kettle, but a cane.
Sure, cane terrace.
Just dropped out of the bottom too. Whichever, it's just a glacial dropping, either way you go. That's what it looks like from the air. Thank God I've got friends with helicopters. And again, that's the river, the Champlain running right next to it. There's a village site found right down in here. But this, see, I hate to go too far, too fast, but basically, they were looking for that to be a huge fort, an Iroquois fort. 10 acres is a lot to defend, to be a fort. How many men would you have to defend the wall of 10 acres? It'd be pretty incredible. This is a picture from the early 1900s. At first it never had any trees on it, and they've only let the trees grow up over the last 70 years, something like that. You can see they're starting to grow up a little bit there. The back side of it. Postcards have been made of Spanish Hill. Back in the 50s, I believe. You just see that. Just so nice, that flat piece up there. And it would have just been a really cool place for people to visit, people to have picnics, and sure they did. Kids, anybody that's just a little bit older than me, they closed it off as private property. When I was in 4th grade, you had to have the okay to go there, but before that, everybody was over there playing. It was the playground for all the kids, looking for arrowheads and sled riding, and it was the place. But in 1878, things changed, and that's because of this guy right here, and you can't see him. General John S. Clark. He actually is the one who brought the story of Carantouan to Spanish Hill. Okay? And if you look at him, I just want to make this point. He was a Duval, and they changed his name. Doesn't he just look like Robert Duval? You see it? Just a little sidebar there. So basically, he was a really well-known surveyor. He was a brigadier general, well-respected in the Civil War. He goes out to survey sites. He teams up with local historians, and he takes it upon himself to actually want to go and find the old Native American sites that are in the old-time books. And so that's what he does. He spends his retired years going out and finding these old sites. Don't you know? He finds the battle site where Champlain was waiting for Etienne. And then he starts pedaling his way back from there, trying to figure out where the village of Carantouan could be. He goes on to be so good at what he does, is that the Iroquois Confederacy actually gives him their name Pathfinder. So he's not just, the average Joe. And by the time he gets done, he says, after very careful study of accessible facts, I hesitantly commit myself to the conclusion that Spanish Hill is nothing more or less than the ancient fortified town, the stronghold of the Carantouans. And because he was a great surveyor, he surveys the top, and he gives us this map. This is 1878, okay? 10 acres. That's where the wall was. There's another wall here that kind of cuts off the entrance from being able to see in. I don't know. what that was, but it's there. And over here, this is huge. This is the embankment that he still saw in 1878, and he puts palisades in it, logs, to make a wall, because he doesn't know what else it could be, because he's never seen anything else. And what does he do? He shows the interior ditch. So important. 1878. So important that he marked that. Archaeologically speaking, if you find a ditch, a moat inside of an earthen wall, it means something totally different than outside. If you're building a castle, where's your moat?
Outside.
And there's where the mistake was made. Everybody was thinking, it's a fort, it's a fort, it's a fort. Fort Ancient. They thought it was a fort. Same thing. So I just want to make a point real quick. Who were the people that met Brule? Susquehannocks. That's well accepted. Captain John Smith. Pocahontas. Captain John Smith, big burly guy in the movie, right? He's probably about this tall, right? Little scrawny guy. And what he did after the Pocahontas story was he started traveling all the rivers going north of the Chesapeake Bay. And he named the Susquehanna River. He named that river the Susquehanna, and he named the people living on it the Susquehannocks. Okay? In Pennsylvania, they talk about the Susquehannocks. The French were calling them the Andasti. The English and the French weren't talking, so they had two different names for them, but they were the same people, just by different names, by different groups. These guys here, basically, Captain John Smith is, he's got these guys in a little boat, they're paddling up the river, and they say, in 1608, 60 of those Susquehannocks came to them on their boat. And he says, what great and well-proportioned men are seldom seen, for they seem like giants to the English, whose calves seem to be 3/4 of a yard around, whose voice seems to come from a vault. Just big monsters to him. And basically, the end story is he got the heck out of there. And that was as much as he ever saw of them, because they scared the tar out of him. He said, whose club was big enough to bust your brains? He goes on and on. You can tell the fear and how he wrote that. In fact, one of the descriptions of the people that came to see him that day had bear heads on his shoulders, like shoulder pads. So his arm would go through the back of the head and out the mouth of the bear on both shoulders, Another guy, pictured here, had a wolf head hanging like a pendant. Scared the tar out of him. And he literally said, I'm out of here. That's as much as we know. Because he turned around and said, that's enough for me. I'm gone. And if you look at his map from 1608, you see that Susquehanna. And there's that giant Native American with a big old club casting a shadow over everything else, because that's as much as he knew. And he wasn't about to go find out anything more. So, let's go back to Champlain's story. The nation is very warlike. They have only 3 villages, and they just keep on making war with each other without assistance from their friends. They're not scared of anybody. And then later on, more and more Europeans show up. And as they're coming up the river, this hill just comes out of nowhere. I mean, everything else is flat, and boom, all of a sudden this hill starts coming up out of there. And when they go up, they seldom miss a chance to talk about those big walls that they see up there. That's why they called it Spanish Hill, because they believe the Spanish were here way earlier and they built some sort of fort up on the top. And so they called it Spanish Hill. The earliest reference that I can get to is 1795, and there's this guy, he's coming up from a French encampment. Basically, it's where they were going to try to take Marie Antoinette and save her. They were going to try to sneak her over here, and they made a little village down near us. She never made it. So that's where this guy's coming from. And he says, near the confines of Pennsylvania, a mountain rises from the bank of the river, Tioga, in the shape of a sugar loaf, which is kind of a cool picture of his brain, which are seen the remains of some entrenchments. These the inhabitants called the Spanish ramparts. But I rather judge them to have been thrown up against the Indians from Chenango. One perpendicular breastwork is yet remaining, which, though covered with grass, bushes, and plainly indicates that a parapet and a ditch have been constructed there. Another guy comes through in 1891, and he's a poet. And he says, now to the left of the raging mountains bend and level plains before us wide extend, where rising lone old Spanish Hill appears, the post of war in ancient unknown years. Its steep and rounded sides with wood and brown, its level top with old entrenchments crowned. (1891), Cyrus Thomas is going around and he's actually trying to record all these sites before they get wiped out. And he actually includes them. This is the Smithsonian that's actually put him out there to do this. And actually Spanish Hill is in the book. And if you look, it's right there, right, as this river comes up and lies. And he doesn't make it a fort. He doesn't say it's a hilltop fort. What he says is, it's an enclosure. The end story is this. There's a lady who took it upon herself to record the early settlers in our area and what they recalled before they passed. And what she said was, many now remember this beautiful flat lawn of several acres on top of the hill, and an enclosure of earth 7 to 8 feet high, which was within a quarter of a century, been leveled by the plow and harrow. So you can see how people saw it, and then all of a sudden they're plowing up there, they're planting up there, and they're leveling these walls right off the edge. And so, when people go up there today, they would see no evidence of those hills. Nothing. No ditch, no anything. It's gone. The Moorhead expedition is one of those quotes that Barry Kent used and said nothing was up there. This is in 1916. The fact of the matter is Moorhead wasn't even there. I don't have evidence that tells me that Moorhead was ever on top of the hill. Because although he was part of this expedition, at this point in the expedition, he was back in Andover. There's a graduation going on. And the letters that go back between him and the people working there do not give me any evidence that he went there. So basically, that's a whole other story. I did a whole presentation on just his expedition. But basically, at the end of the day, he never says that there's nothing on top of the Spanish Hill. He just basically says it was rainy and there were Boy Scouts helping out the guys, and you know, they put different post holes in there, or test pits, but they couldn't actually go on the 10 acres. They could only go around the edge because they were there in the summer and it was all being cultivated. They were all, I don't know if it's corn or whatever they were planting. I mean, they were not going to be able to get out there and actually take any kind of a look. So, from that, Barry Kent said, he didn't find anything there. Well, if Barry would have just turned the page, all he had to do is just turn the page. And there was another site. It was called Sugar Creek. And this is what they say. Traces of a fortified hilltop, there being distinct traces of embankments, this being smaller than Spanish Hill, but resembled the same. You missed it by one page. This is another person's drawing of the top of the hill, and this is prior to the general that I was just talking about. You see that same wall he drew on his too, which is incredible. These guys lived there, the shepherds. So, there you go. Here's the question. Earthen embankments, interior ditches. What the heck were they doing up there, right? Well, E.G. Squire had gone around the whole country and looked at these sites. But what did he say? He said the circumstances of a ditch being within the wall is a distinguishing mark between religious and military works. If you go to the Great Circle, if you go to any of these sites, Fort Ancient, if you go to any sites out in Ohio or anything, every one of them have a completely flat lawn with interior ditches and earthen embankment walls. Every one of them. He also goes on to say, the sacred place, according to our authority, could not be approached by anyone but the Magi or the priests. So not everybody was going up there. It was a special place. Captain John Smith actually had gone up the Susquehanna far enough to be able to find some of these himself. And he says, this place they account so holy that none but the priests nor kings dare into it, nor savages dare go up in boats by it. Remember that river, how close it is today. And this is the closer for me. This is Louise Wells Murray. She's my hero. She's like the early historian for our area. Started the Tide Point Museum. And what does she say? Early in the last century, Alpheus Harris settled at the foot of the hill. An old Indian was a frequent visitor. But when he asked the Indian to go up the hill, he said, I cannot go up that hill. There is a great spirit up there that would kill me if I go up there. And again, this is the Fort Ancient site that I was talking about. This is out in Ohio. This is the old fort site. This is the new fort. This was built later on, but it is actually with the river running to the west. Embankments, interior ditch. Spanish Hill is 230 feet to the top. Just a guess, Dave. How tall do you think this? How high do you think this one is? 230 feet to its top. They did out on their website, you know, a reenactment of the wall and the ditch, and they put water in it because nobody really knows what they used up there. Today they believe, well, they thought it was a fort. Moorhead, actually, is the one that did this. They thought it was a fort in his day. And then they called these people the Fort Ancients. And now they know that it was the Hopewell. And it wasn't a fort. It was a ceremonial space. So when we go back to like religious structures of the Druids, they usually are places of deliberation and council. So this is E.G. Squire again. Within them, the priests perform ceremonies of religion, and within them, chiefs and warriors gather to consult on public affairs, to make war, and to conclude peace. What did we say Brulé went to Spanish Hill for? What did he say happened when he got there? Well, this is actually, I took the page right out of the book, so you guys couldn't question what I had to say. He says, some days were spent in this friendly reception, and after Boulay had told them his mission and explained to them the occasion of the journey, the savages of the place assembled in council to deliberate and resolve in regard to the sending of the 500 warriors. It's exactly what they did. And we also know, he says, this nation is very warlike. They only have 3 villages. And, he says, once the council ended, they had to go out and collect the people. You see, Barry Kent, the people who were against this whole plan thought Carantouan was that hill. That 4,000 people must have lived on top of that hill if it was Carantouan. The 3 villages, they never even considered. It didn't, I don't know why they didn't think about that, but their whole argument against Spanish Hill being this place was that they had to have 4,000 people there, being that they could give up 500, was their calculation. And where's the evidence in the ground? Where's all the garbage for 4,000 people at Spanish Hill? And I'm saying it's not there because that's not what this was. And there's 3 other villages where those people lived. And Champlain told us that. So, you know, at the end of the day, that's the story, and that was the controversy that I muddled through over the years to finally get people to be convinced that this actually is this amazing place. In those years, there's now been a house been put on top of the hill. There's now been other structures been put on top of the hill. There's now been all of these different things. I've had lawyers call me that I'm not supposed to talk about Spanish Hill. And I just keep on plodding along. But I believe this is so important. And for me, starting the museum was part of what I could do, you know, for this place. You know, for me, there's so many collectors out there that have evidence from this hill and other places. Our museum is now filled with private collections that have been donated that now show us evidence from those places. And we have a special space that talks about Spanish Hill, of course, too. But I think that's why I like to do these talks. That's why I like to share this information. That's why I have a website and all these other things that I do, because it can't be lost again. You know what I mean? I saw it, as I read all these, I saw it was lost. These people already knew the story, and then it was lost, and now it's been found again. And I just feel like, you know what, we're going to keep it this time. So that's basically my story. In 1615, he came. In 1915, the 300th anniversary, they actually celebrated on top of the hill this whole story. And it wasn't until that next 100 years that everything got muddy and had to be cleared up again. And this is pretty cool, because it was 1915, they still had some Civil War soldiers. And so they thought warriors, and so they had on the south, this guy on the south, he was from the south, this guy was from the north, and they had 2 flags over this stone that they had carved, commemorating Roulet's trip, and they raised those as a part of their service. And this is just a really cool thing. They say, you know, basically, you know, there weren't any cars, there weren't any, it was very, you know, different time. So, you know, basically the drum corps goes up there with a couple of instruments, and they just start playing. And people from, you know, 3 towns away can hear them. And they just start to come. Imagine what that was like 400 years